Hey, everybody, this is TJR.
And this is Robert Kinsler. And it's hard to believe, but 1983 was 40 years ago. What's not as surprising, maybe looking back from here in 2023, is how many great and groundbreaking albums were released back that year. What a year. What can you say? On this episode, TJR and I are going to discuss the wide range of releases that came out that year and highlight each of our favorite albums. So we're each going to talk about our three favorite albums from a very big year. And so here's some of the key releases of our on our collective radar. Why don't you kick it off, TJ?
Sure. First of all, 1983, we had quite a few interesting debuts that year. Artists who just showed up and we didn't know who they were at first. Some of them made a bigger splash on their debut, some of them didn't, but some of them would go on to become legendary. And so, first of all, Big Country's The Crossing, REM, Murmur, their debut, Tears for Fears, The Hurting, and here we go. There was this album by this little known heavy metal band called Metallica in 1983, and their debut, Kill 'Em All. Yeah, Kill 'Em All. There we go. Sorry, I said that better that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe on the other end of the spectrum is artists who maybe the world had kind of forgot about that came back big time, namely David Bowie and ZZ Top. These were two incredible 70s artists that reinvented themselves truly and made huge comebacks with Let's Dance and Eliminator.
Yeah, those were big albums, really big albums. Yeah. I'm going to pick it up here and discuss hard rock and metal, which during the 80s, there was that whole spandex glam metal scene. We saw some really big releases and a few big debuts in the genre of metal and hard rock. 1983, we saw the debut by Slayer entitled Show No Mercy. And one of the legendary metal vocalists, his first solo debut, although he had worked with other bands previously, Ronnie James Dio, his debut, Holy Diver. Oh, and Quiet Riot, who in the 80s, briefly there just ruled the metal scene with their debut album, Mental Health. Also in the genre of hard rock and metal, Def Leppard went for a more pop sound and released their chart-topping album Pyromania, which of course huge, tons of hit singles that we're still listening to this day. Kiss took off the makeup and released Lick It Up. Motley Crue continued their success streak that started with the 1981's Too Fast for Love with Shout at the Devil, which was even bigger than their debut. And Ozzy Osbourne found life after Randy Rhoads and released Bark at the Moon. Iron Maiden, they released Peace of Mind in 1983. It was their highest charting release up to that point, and it featured two tracks that are still part of their live set list: The Trooper, a song that I used to cover in one of my old garage bands, and The Flight of Icarus. AC/DC, they just kept doing what they always did best, which was just be AC/DC. I think that's one of the keys to their success, is just being consistently who they are. Their ninth studio album, Flick of the Switch.
Yeah, great. That's a pretty great list within 1983. And speaking of heavy metal, let's move on to progressive rock, a very different subgenre, obviously, than hard rock. And progressive rock was also a big part of 1983. Genesis scored one of their biggest selling albums with their self-titled Genesis album. Yes met the 80s on their own terms big time and released 90125, which featured some of their biggest chart hits. And Asia, who had one of the biggest albums of the year before, returned with their sophomore album, Alpha. So progressive rock, not quite as big as hard rock at that time or heavy metal at that time, still was making itself felt in the world too.
It was a tough time for progressive rock because the whole music scene was changing, and all these progressive rock bands managed to basically streamline their sound and make it
Exactly.
more commercial, make it more commercial and appeal to radio. They managed to do that. Now, of course, outside of those genres, we just saw a lot of big albums come out. First of all, former Led Zeppelin frontman Robert Plant, whose solo career continues to this day. He's still releasing new stuff. He in 1983 he topped his debut album Pictures at 11 with its follow-up Principle of Moments. Scored some big hits with that album. A lot of fans, Zeppelin fans and Plant fans, still talk about that album as one of his absolute best. Although I might argue that on another video. Huey Lewis and the News, they released their third album that year, which was their biggest selling album of all time, which was just huge in 1983. It was all over the place. So many hit singles. You couldn't turn on the radio without hearing a song off that album. Eurythmics released not one but two of their biggest albums in 1983. Sweet Dreams Are Made of This and Touch. And these two albums, of course, contained their biggest hits of their careers. Talking Heads released Speaking in Tongues, featuring the classic Burning Down the House. And The Police. The Police gave us their landmark thematic concept album entitled Synchronicity, an album that also, of course, produced some of their biggest hits. U2 broke through big time with their third full-length LP, War. And you can kind of just watch that escalation of U2 from album to album as they reach that pinnacle, that pinnacle with Unforgettable Fire and Joshua Tree. Stevie Ray Vaughan began to rewrite what blues meant in the 20th century with Texas Flood. The Fix hit big time with Reach the Beach. Bryan Adams broke globally with Cuts Like a Knife. And Billy Idol fused metal and new wave for his aptly titled Rebel Yell album, scored some of the biggest hits of his career with that one. Lastly, Men at Work released their stellar second studio album, Cargo, featuring some of Robert's favorites. I know some of your favorite stuff. Tracks such as It's a Mistake and Overkill. And so those were some of the big releases in 1983. And if we've left anything out or missed anything, just, put it in the comments so that we can all share that. So now, Robert and I are going to each be discussing our three favorite album releases from that year. Now, these were not necessarily the most commercially successful or critically acclaimed, as determined by music critics and music fans, industry insiders. Not necessarily that, although we might bring up some that were huge for those that were critically well received and huge for all the reasons I just mentioned. That might happen, but just our own personal top three is what we're going to discuss. And there is one album that we both want to talk about that we both have on our list, so we're going to discuss it twice.
Okay.
And this should be fun. I
Right.
don't know if I was thinking maybe we should flip a coin,
Yeah.
but we decided to be amicable and both just discuss the albums that we want to discuss, even if there's some duplication. So Robert, why don't you just go ahead and kick it off? What's your first one?
Well, I had to kick off the list with U2's album War, and you just talked a little bit about it, TJ. This was an album released in February of 1983, and it was an album and ultimately a band that impacted me massively beginning in that year. I think I've talked about it before on a previous video that we did together. I saw the band at the US Festival on May 30th, 1983. That was a very big day for me. The band, I got there in time to see U2. It was very difficult to get there because of this was an early predecessor of things like Coachella and stuff, a massive festival. But the band that day, their performance floored me, and a number of the best songs they performed in that set were off this album. They did Sunday Bloody Sunday, they did 40, Two Hearts Beat as One, and New Year's Day. And New Year's Day, as I've talked about on our favorite songs episode, is one of my favorite songs of all time. I think, I don't remember exactly how quickly I went out and purchased War on vinyl, but it was definitely a few days after that I had to, I've seen U2 at least 25 times since seeing
Yeah.
them at the F Festival, and that album I've played countless times. It's just a great classic, album that I'll never get tired of.
This album, of course, not on my list, but I'd like to just opine on it very briefly. I really feel like it's on this third album that U2 starts to become U2 as we think of them. The first two albums I think are good, but they're still kind of developing their sound. I think they're still figuring out who they are. I think October, the second, that one that's in between, number two, is a really good album, but they're
Yeah,
still figuring out who they are. But with War, I think it all kind of starts to really coalesce who U2 is. And also the song New Year's Day, when I that's the song where I first started to become aware of who this band was. I began to hear that song playing on the radio quite frequently. And I remember, these guys have a unique sound. And interestingly enough, I always kind of thought that U2 during that period of War, Unforgettable Fire, and Joshua Tree, they reminded me a lot of Led Zeppelin, which makes a lot of people scratch their heads when I tell them that. But and someday I'll talk about that in a video, why the similarities I always saw. But yeah, that was the song where I first became aware that U2 was this band that was out there and started to get curious and wanted to hear more.
yeah.
But anyways,
Yeah,
please
and
move
we
on.
could
Yes.
probably someday do a full video on even just on War and U2 at that time, just how special they were and what they brought, amidst all the new wave and all the keyboards and all the stuff. What they were, apart from that, I guess they were kind of lumped in it
They
in
were
terms of
part of it, but they weren't at
they
the
were
same
part of it,
time.
but very separate. And just,
Yeah.
they were Irish, and like they'd make a big point of saying we're not, they were very proud of their Irish roots. They weren't trying to say we're an American band, we're an English band. They were very defiant and had this really amazing sound, and they had something to say, especially beginning with this album. So yeah, and I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, it's a brilliant album, and it never loses its power over the decades at all. So.
Absolutely. So what's your
Now,
second
now,
pick?
now, the next album, and you briefly mentioned it, I want to talk about is the Fix's album, Reach the Beach. Now, this was the second studio album from the Fix, and they were a British band, and it was released in May of '83. And I caught the Fix when they were opening up for another much larger group at Hollywood Park on September 6th of that year, and they made quite an impression on me. I realized that, I guess maybe I had heard them on the radio and heard some of their singles, but seeing them live again, it was kind of like the U2 thing. It drove me to explore their albums, particularly Reach the Beach. And I was really impressed with the sound of the album and what they were doing, and particularly I thought the singer, and I'll probably butcher his name here, Cy Cernan, thought he was a fantastic vocalist. And that album includes One Thing Leads to Another and Saved by Zero. And I think that these are songs that, again, kind of like what we were talking about, they've not lost any of their power or their ability to move me after 40 years. And so Reach the Beach is on my list.
Awesome. Awesome. I, of course, not real familiar. I knew the radio hits back in the day, but recently on one of my vintage vinyl hunts, going to like estate sales and that sort of thing, I got a copy of the album and have started to really listen to it for the first time. And I think it's a pretty solid record. Pretty solid record. Great sounding album too, as well. Love the guitar tone. Love that crystal clear,
Yeah.
like guitar tone. The band that
Yeah,
I
they're
can't
a
think of his
really
name,
good
but
band. And I'll say if people go see them, I think with the exception of maybe the drummer, it's all the original lineup from that time, and they are still a very good band. And they play in relatively intimate performances. They play at festivals too. But I recommend people, if go check out the Fix, and then maybe check out this album as well. You know, and last but not least, I'm
Mhm.
going to highlight one of the albums that I think is the world, there's a big consensus that this is a great album, and that's Synchronicity from the Police, which was released in June of 1983. And, I have to tell everyone, I went to see the Police and the Fix were opening, but let's go back to the Police. This is just an incredible album. I mean, beyond the hits, it's just groundbreaking how they're fusing different styles of music. And I think that not only are their musical performances that are captured on the recording virtuosic, but just what they're saying, like songs like, Every Breath You Take and King of Pain, the emotion is so palpable on these tracks. And this is just a really special album, and and makes me sad that the Police didn't continue on really after this album. I think that they left it while they were at the very top. And that's,
Yeah.
very sad. But I know you probably have some things to say about this album too, TJ.
Well, of course, this was the album we almost fought over here.
Yeah.
This is the one I was referring to earlier. I was like, you had already picked the Police Synchronicity, and I thought, wait a minute, I want that one on mine too. And I thought, well, we'll talk about it. And so I am going to start my list now, and I'm going to, of course, pick up here with the Police Synchronicity, and of course, widely regarded as one of the band's most significant albums. Um, it's their last album, and you can kind of view it as this whole culmination of this band's, what I would describe as this band's unique blend of reggae, punk, and new wave. And when you look at the first album, you take it up to here, you just see how much this band grew, in such a short time frame. And you see how much they grew. Like you said, they reached a peak and became at that time the biggest band in the world at that point.
They really were.
Yeah, but we didn't realize it was going to be their last album at that point. And I don't know at what point they realized it, but yeah, it really is a band exploring more experimental and sophisticated musical territory. It was a big hit making machine for them, as you've said, to be sure. But some of my favorite tracks were the deep cuts, and so I'll highlight some of those. Of course, there's the opening track, Synchronicity 1. This is one of those power tracks. I call it a power track. The pulsating synth riff and the driving bass and drums. When I listen to that, I feel almost superhuman. And I've got the headphones and I'm listening. I feel like I could almost run, 100 miles an hour. Like I could perform superhuman feats. It's just that kind of a song. It does that for you. And I talked about this next song on one of our top 100 songs of all times episodes. The manic paranoid craziness of Mother. Mm-hmm. And of course, like I said, I discussed that on our previous show. And then, of course, also the very dark dystopian intensity of Synchronicity 2, a song that lyrically delves into themes of internal turmoil, societal pressure, and existential horror. Yeah, Many Miles Away. There's a shadow on the door of a cottage on the shore of a dark Scottish lake.
Great lyrics.
I get goosebumps every time I listen to that. And and then at the end, as Sting keeps saying, many miles away, many miles away, many miles away. Just like, oh man, that just fills me with all kinds of like terror, the good kind. But yeah, this album cemented the band's status as the biggest band of the 80s up to that point. And then, of course, they handed the torch to U2 from there. And U2 took that on.
Exactly. Yeah. And like maybe I'm circling the drain here, but it would have been so interesting to see if they'd continue on, to see if they had pushed themselves in new directions and also pushed U2. Yeah. Although I think U2 kind of had its own little world. But yeah, it was a fascinating period. 83 was a great year, and I think that this album kind of certifies that. But go ahead, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say on the other albums, TJ.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I've got two more here. Next on my list is Yes, 90125. It was almost like it was really what started the band starting over again. And initially the band was going to be called Cinema, until, of course, they brought back in, the original lead singer, John Anderson. Once he came back into the fold, they said, okay, this is basically a new Yes album. And they went from there. But they managed to take on the 80s, be more commercial sounding, but they did it without losing any of their musical credibility.
Exactly.
Strong musicianship, their ability to write complex, unique arrangements, parts. They managed to get that in there. They just did it in a more, I guess, slicker way. to still be able to do that. This was a band that I'm sure that most critics had written off as a relic because they'd broken up.
Mhm.
For all intent and purposes, prior to that album, they had broken up. And of course, like I said, this was going to be a project called Cinema until John Anderson came back, and then they said, okay, there's enough of us here to call this Yes, even though we've got a few lineup changes. They'd had lineup changes in the past, but yeah, they found a way to craft and combine their progressive and technical musicianship with commercially viable radio songs. Some of that modern 80s appeal does have to be attributed to former Yes member Trevor Horn, who stepped in as producer. So you've
Mhm.
got a member of Yes producing the album too. And he has to be somewhat credited for giving it that slick production that it has. But you also have to give a lot of credit to the new kid on the block, the new blood, guitarist Trevor Rabin, who really had that 80s guitar sound just firmly under his belt. From
Yeah.
the chorus driven power chords with distortion in the chorus to the bell like guitar clean chiming sounds, he really had that sound down well. But also another thing that a lot of people don't maybe not realize is that a lot of the tracks that are on the album, the foundations, I'm not saying the other band members didn't contribute after the fact, but the foundations came from a lot of his demos that he had already been working on. So those things, of course, all combined into creating this kind of reinvention of Yes. And um, and honestly, as big as that album was, I'm getting off track, but the follow up that came after that, Big Generator, I thought was even better. Maybe I'll talk about that on a separate video sometime. But I just had to give a quick props to that one.
Yeah, no, and thanks for highlighting that. And I didn't know some of the details you just discussed. I want to revisit this album and listen to it again. Yeah, I'm very excited just to learn some of the things you discussed there. And yeah,
Cool.
it's so nice that Yes has had this long career, and like you said, they kind of had this new part of their career launched here with this album.
Absolutely. And now finally, my third album here is going to be Stevie Ray Vaughan, Texas Blood. And earlier, I mentioned that Stevie Ray Vaughan rewrote what the blues meant in the 20th century, and I mean that. And it all started with this debut album. This is the album that, of course, kicked off his signature song, Pride and Joy, and it's the album that kicked off his career. It was his debut. Along with the aforementioned Pride and Joy, Texas Blood also features some insane guitar, I would say insane guitar hero making instrumentals. There's Testify, and there's Rude Mood. It also sits alongside covers by Buddy Guy, Wolf, the Isley Brothers. I credit to a certain extent Stevie Ray Vaughan with repopularizing guitar virtuosity, at least blues guitar virtuosity. We had lots of metal guys out there doing the tap bend stuff, but he really repopularized blues, roots and Americana guitar virtuosity. And this album was recorded in just 3 days.
Wow.
And it displays him and his band uh, just how well they knew their material, because they had cut their teeth playing all these tracks live at probably, I'm guessing, going to guess hundreds and hundreds of shows, before they recorded this album. So they just came in, banged it out in 3 days, and basically played live.
Yeah.
Yeah. During his
And
short time, Stevie Ray Vaughan, his virtuosity helped popularize blues, in my opinion, repopularize it again, I should say, because it kind of was starting to fall off the map, in my opinion. And he opened the door for countless new blues acts that would follow. And it could be argued that to a certain extent, he helped to repopularize a whole slew of legacy artists in the process. So, this may not have been his best album. It was his first, but like I said, it started here, him basically rewriting what blues meant in the 20th century.
TJ, it's so important. I think, whether it's Johnny Lang, Kenny Wade Shepherd, Joe Bonamassa, I think there's a whole group of current modern day guitar heroes that might not be playing to big audiences if it were not for what Stevie Ray Vaughan did in kind of reintroducing that sound and that dynamic style of electric blues guitar to audiences. So I think you're right. It's a great, mind blowing that they recorded that album in 3 days, and boy, what a great album.
Yeah. There's a whole lineage you can follow, like you just said.
Oh
There's
yeah.
a whole lineage you can follow. So there we go. There's our top three. Now it's your turn. We've named off a whole bunch of albums. If there's something we missed, let us know. Put it in the comments. And then tell us what's your top three out of the ones we listed and any ones we might have forgotten. Let us know your top three. We'll be looking forward to checking out your responses. Robert, this was fun. I really got to give you credit because you're the one who actually had this idea, and you're the one who put together the list, who actually put together the list. So I really appreciate
Yeah.
that.
Well, it was fun. Hey, you know, it was an amazing year. I said it at the beginning of this video, but I can't believe it's been 40 years. It's like, where have those years gone?
Man. And maybe we'll follow this up. Maybe we should follow this up and do 1973, 50 years ago.
I think we should.
We're listening.
I think there was a slew of great albums in 73. Yeah,
I'm sure
I
there
think we
was.
should.
Once we take a look, let us know what you think of that, everybody. If you like these videos, be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell notification icon so you never miss a video. A big thank you to the patron supporters. Patron supporters receive exclusive weekly videos not available on this channel. But mostly just thank you for watching and hanging out and commenting. We really appreciate that. And we'll see you in the next video, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.